And we are live. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Open Publishing Fest. My name is Dan Rudman. I am the Associate Director of Punctum Books and also one of the organizers on the Open Publishing Fest. This is the end, I guess, of our first week. And we've had a really amazing program so far. People have given demos of open source software and talked about their open access publishing and open hardware. And we've had a few performances. And right now I'm really excited to be hosting our first reading of the festival. And today we have 4 authors who have published books pretty recently with Punctum Books. And they are Dulce Smith, Eva-Lynn Jagoe, A.W. Strouse, and Sasha Zamler-Carhart. And so we're going to let each of them read from their work. And let's begin with Dulce Smith. Just a quick introduction. A poet in the off hours, Dulce Smith works as a librarian at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where he supports open access publishing, among other projects. He has authored book chapters on critical librarianship and composition pedagogy, and his poetry appears in several literary journals. Rough Notes to Erasure is his first book, which he'll be reading from, I believe, today. Thank you so much for being here, Dulce.
Thank you. So the book is divided into three parts critical essay and 1 part personal narrative. There was an additional 1/3 of something more like poetry, but on my editor's sage advice, those rough notes never made it to print. But at any rate, before I read, I would be remiss not to express my deepest gratitude for the work that Punctum is doing in general, and in particular for the care that they took with my book. And part of that care was their patience in letting this book take shape as it wanted to, or as it needed to. And a good part of that shape is, you might say, a pronounced nervousness about itself or about the risks, intellectual, moral, and aesthetic of the very exposure that this text performs. So with that little preamble, I'm going to read a brief excerpt from the introduction and then a slightly longer excerpt from the autobiographical chapter, a passage which evokes certain aspects of the author's adolescence. And the full title of the book is Rough Notes to Erasure, White Male Privilege, My Senses, and the Story I Cannot Tell. The story of this book is, in a way, about my failure to tell a story. Beyond the seesaw between explications push and implications pull, writing has meant, for me, a commitment to deferring the question. Refusing to show my work, I have opted instead to write my own writing, i.e. the fact of my having written, into erasure. This program testifies to how I have sought to earn my own privilege, including the opportunity that a white man with a middle-class upbringing and education enjoys to land jobs that don't leave him too poor or exhausted for unremunerated pursuits, like writing this book in the off hours. Or it testifies to my desire to earn an exemption from the subordination to waged work that is even the white man's lot. At any rate, though never quickly enough to stop time's passage through the flesh, I've sought to earn something that I both do and do not have, seeking to prove myself exceptional in one domain, as a writer. And I've preferred to keep that effort private rather than expose myself to the risk of failure. But this failure, the failure that I have been afraid to risk, is really the failure of the project or promise itself. I mean the promise that one's whiteness or white masculinity can mean more than the violent pursuit of possession through the erasure of others' potential, more than one's complicity in the erasure of one's own potential for the sake of another's profits. The fiction of interiority expresses a desire to close off the self from those histories, personal, national, and global, that challenge one's claims to such potential. But this attempt to escape from the folds of history is bound to fail, fracturing one's relations to others and to oneself. And yet, far from being a cause for reckoning, such failure can become something that the subject clamps down on, as if failure could serve as its own justification, assuming mythic proportions in the stories we tell ourselves, stories about the minotaur we harbor in our breast. In this way, the white man is monk, like the poet monk, for whom the profession of failure, internalized, becomes a vocation in itself. But through every piece of writing, you can trace threads that are the gifts of others. And while the Academy increasingly plays host to a discourse that links practices of citation to the regime of private property, we might imagine citation's kinship with other traditions, other ways of thinking through, rather than deferring or effacing, the commons. One might think about, for instance, the Black Atlantic compositional traditions of the mix, the sample, and the improvisational text or score. I'm on the terrain here of a debt that I cannot hope to acquit, even as I must acknowledge, following Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, that, quote, the Black aesthetic is not about technique, is not a technique, end quote. It's a way of folding space and time, of seeing what happens when one aspect gets articulated through the grain of another, in a texture that pulls against itself, neither one being the shadow or reflection of the other, but together displacing form even as they produce it. Failure or not, my writing exposes my debt to those, living and dead, in the grain of whose works and days I become what I am, and whose aspect my selfhood numbs me to. In writing this book, I tried to quicken my senses to that debt, without making a sideshow of the modern world's profound reserves of suffering and pain. And I've come back again and again to the grain of the sentence and the phrase, trying to improvise with, not improve upon, the brilliance of those whom I cite. For as Moten suggests, quote, phrasing where form, grammar, sound, cuts and augments meaning in the production of content is where implication most properly resides, end quote. Phrasing is the spool whereby, fool that I have been, I can find my way back to you. And then the next section is from the third chapter. To be off-brand was to run scared within the ranks of white privilege, praying to pass muster. With limbs flailing to catch the football, to dodge the dodgeball, somehow to stand under, but also to avoid the softball in its excruciating tumescent descent toward the outfield, where I had hoped to escape notice, but now all eyes followed the ball to my failure's foregone conclusion. Or in the locker room, where my passive disposition provoked a fascinated cruelty, where I could be hoisted by the throat, where I smelled like onion rings, where there was no dodging other bodies, and the flesh was a thing I could get no purchase on, the theme of coded, salacious talk, and the object of taunts and terror. To wrest self-possession from there was to train your feelings and fantasies and desires in a direction toxic to them, and to misrecognize this fact as though toxicity were sweet. With envy whetted against shame, to listen rapt to cherub-faced white boys wearing leather bomber jackets as they told tales of sexual conquest, and to laugh loudly as they taunted their exes to the tune of Guns N' Roses. Back off, bitch. And the girls, too, had to laugh it off, learning that white femininity required of them this tolerance for obnoxious behavior that could veer without warning into something far more severe. And for me to be thrilled at being in on the joke, as if cruelty were something that could carry us, our voices giddy and aloft, across the sky, leaving our bodies back on earth, was only to stand, waiting, beside a swagger that did not suit me, longing for an intimacy with these girls on terms that I could not express. Not in my father's language, not in the language of these boys. With a soft voice on the phone saying, "My friend Sarah likes you, Do you like Sarah? I felt something like time itself leaking out of my chest, and it left a mother of a hole. And in that hole, I heard myself yelling, I don't know, leave me alone. There was an overnight field trip. We were in a hotel. The other boys found a softcore channel which cast a blue hush on the room. As when my father, years before, had taken me to horror movies or whatever other R-rated fare he desired, I watched through thatched fingers, seeing nothing but myself on the edge of myself. A boy's leather bomber jacket lay draped over the back of a chair, its lining silk-screened with a map of the world. Renunciation became my secret study, to be ready at all times to renounce love, for only this readiness can equip you for the failure that plagues the power not to fail. This thought arms Kierkegaard's demonic individual. It weaponizes the blankness of whiteness itself. Quote, there was to be no more giving of myself. All giving was to be outlawed henceforth under a new name, and that name was waste, end quote. What did I know about waste? But it was my body's study. Ashamed of being so skinny, and in defiance of our father's policed portions at lunch and dinner, I turned defiance inward and curbed my appetite. The brown bag lunch he carefully prepared, the sandwich in wax paper with its single slippery slice of turkey or ham, the apple bruised on one side, squishing the sandwich on the other, and filling the bag with a noisome sweetness, got chucked every morning into the dumpster by the bus stop. Daddy's love came from a place of deep hunger. I knew that much, and I vowed to stamp out the same in myself. You got to step into it, bring it to you between your right arm and your chest. Put it in the breadbasket, Dulce. Put it in the goddamn breadbasket. Try as he might to teach me, I could never catch a football. My chest, I felt, could hold no bread, nor could it stop a projectile hurled with that love's force. I taught myself to dodge Daddy's love, and I shrank into myself. With my backpack heavy with homework, I cultivated Victorian passions. Awake in my lower bunk, my clamshell headphones throbbing, I thought about certain white girls in my class who seemed, through some rumored experience or secret trauma, to have been stranded ahead of their years. And in my mind, they led me by the hand back to some botanical attic where, in each other's arms, we could be children again. What did I know about sex, beyond a few verbal fetishes shared with my little brother, like crotch piece, a nonce word borrowed from the partible bodies of our G.I. Joes? But the flesh knew itself as partible, and soggy as bread, and full of a noisome sweetness. I broke my arm and wrote a poem. I held my cast gingerly against the small of a classmate's back at the 8th grade prom, our bodies themselves like plaster casts, protecting what we didn't know about ourselves. I held Sarah's hand limply for the space of a few tight breaths in the bleachers at the homecoming game. We didn't know that we already knew what it was to be bruised by love and time. Under the glare of the halide lights, the bodies of the players, mostly black, collided on the field below. The radio and MTV sponsored our senses, rallying us with anthems by C&C Music Factory. Crushing, we drank from the gospel swoon of Boys to Men and Whitney Houston. Bobbing our heads to Belle Biv DeVoe, we tasted something that raised the hair on the backs of our necks as the beat sent shudders past the edge of what we understood. Our flesh was the hem of a garment that we touched, longing to be cured. But the poison that ailed us wasn't a girl. It was the distillate of a structure that granted our bodies the power to fail at others' expense and to profit by their pain. We consumed black pain, repackaged and commodified. We white boys sagged our jeans and salted our speech with bruh. With the white girls in our grade, we made an enclosure of our bodies on the cement porch of McKinley Magnet High, inside a driveway separated by razor wire from the wooden frame houses of a neighborhood that stood blocks away from the heart of planter affluence, rife with private security, manicured azaleas, and white colonnades. The vice principal, a military-cut white man in a Sears green polyester suit, strode up and down the halls with a wooden paddle at his side. We white boys cultivated cruelty in our voices and our postures, the cruelty that watched behind my father's eyes, that strikes at the gut, that sounds too much like love. We regaled each other and rolled our eyes. We shoved and joshed and egged each other on. We embodied the logic of plantation power that Clyde Woods has written about, keeping to our tight, cruel circle, policing our pyramid, while the meaty paramilitary arm of the state put the screws to all those who, against the white screen of our self-love, passed by in silhouette. Collectively, we ignored, avoided, and neglected our Black classmates, like the Black neighbors we avoided and the Black workers we ignored or talked down to. I have no doubt that there were more overt forms of racism at work around me too, the overtness of which I was being trained to miss. But from the Blackness in our milieu, we white kids leached a language and a kind of hunger for being, which lit up our insides with feelings that we had no name for. Feelings born of the radiance of a history of resilience that held no meaning for us as anything but feeling. And what was that feeling for us but the nimbus of moments promising a taste of our potential as it evaporated into the present? In the foyer of the state capitol, the wax tiles rang with the coming and going of a grand old power, a power undaunted by the scandal of its brutality and proud even of its corrupt, predatory drive. This was the power of, quote, a regime that elevated armed robbery to a governing principle, end quote. There, a young white man in a suit approached our youth and legislature group and singled me out for an officious pump of his hand. "Welcome to the Capitol, son. I'm your state representative, David Duke." He had a voice smooth and dangerous as oil. Did my homeschool haircut and hand-me-down cardigan, the dressiest article I could muster, declare me ripe for radicalization? Or was it something else? Except when in the classroom, where the allure of being a white lady teacher's pet proved irresistible, I studied how to be innocuous, inconspicuous, incognito. I gave assent when it was required, but hardly ever with fervor. I occupied the shadow of a participatory distance, part envy, part desire to please, that was calculated not to offend, posing no threat to those who felt entitled to be in charge. At the same time, my posture spelled, inside every offer of submissiveness, a refusal to disclose, my shoulders slouched, my eyes trained on the distance or the floor. "Hunched over like a professor," my father said, and that refusal itself, like a thing soldered to the body, bore the stamp of Daddy's love. Thank you very much, and thank everyone for listening.
Thank you so much. That was Dulce Smith reading from his recently published book, Rough Notes to Erasure. Up next is Eva-Lynn Jagoe. Eva-Lynn Jagoe is a professor of comparative literature and Spanish at University of Toronto, where she teaches critical and cultural theory, environmental humanities, Latin American studies, film, and literature. She has run residencies at the Banff Center and teaches public-facing writing for academics. She is also a certified Iyengar yoga teacher and an aspiring novelist. Thanks so much for being here, Eva-Lynn.
Thank you. So I'll be reading, I just kind of picked 2 short chapters at random from the middle of the book. The book is called Take Her, She's Yours, and it's a kind of memoir critical theory hybrid about psychoanalysis and feminism and sexuality. So here from the middle of the book is a chapter called Error. I may have erred about the Proust. Dr. O, so that's what I call the psychoanalyst throughout, Dr. O was referring to our session 2 days earlier, when I had talked about Dolores going back to El Salvador for a month when I was 10. Before she left for the airport, she had kissed me repeatedly, crying that she didn't want to leave me alone for so long. That night, I lay on top of my bed, clutching my oversized stuffed polar bear and sobbing loudly. I wanted my mother to hear my lonely despair, though I was simultaneously embarrassed by my excessive emotion. As I wailed, part of me wondered if I was acting, if I was really that sad. What was I trying to achieve with that loudness? Telling Dr. O, I began to cry, caught up in the conundrum of wanting to be acknowledged while fearing judgment. In a repetition of my childhood suspicion, I distrusted my tears. I wondered, from a distance that made it seem as if I were hovering above myself, if my crying was an attention-seeking ploy used to elicit belief and pity. This all made me think of the early scene in Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, in which Marcel lies in bed wishing for his mother's goodnight kiss. He gets increasingly anxious and overwrought, so much that his parents take pity on him and his mother sleeps in his room that night. It is both a victory and a defeat, since he got the thing he most wanted at the expense of his mother seeing him as weak and fragile. It is not until he is older that he can begin to understand how fundamental that contradiction has been in his life. In the isolation of his quiet, cork-lined room, he puts into words those inchoate feelings that until now have hovered in his unconscious. I quote, "But of late, I have been increasingly able to catch, if I listen attentively, the sound of the sobs. In reality, their echo has never ceased. It is only because life is now growing more and more quiet round about me that I hear them anew, like those convent bells which are so effectively drowned during the day by the noises of the street that one would suppose them to have been stopped, until they sound out again through the silent evening air." End quote. I wasn't crying as I described this scene in detail, but I was still very caught up in the poignancy of the sobs that have always been there, and that I was beginning to hear in myself through the attentive listening of analysis. Interrupting my train of thought, Dr. O said, "Abstracting strong emotion through a turn to literature?" I went silent. And then forcefully I said, "You know that's not true. That moment in Proust breaks me open. It allows me to hear and access something in myself that is closer than I could get if I just described it. You should already know that about me, that talking about books is not a way to get distance, but rather to feel more and to bring those feelings into language." The next day, I lay on the couch for a long time. I didn't know why I was silent. I just knew that I didn't want to talk. When I finally did, I talked about the craziness of my life. I was hosting a guest speaker. Liam had gotten in trouble at school. David was depressed, but had taken up juggling. My lover and I had just had a late night tryst, and I had to write a piece for my critical writing class on Barthes' A Lover's Discourse. It wasn't only my husband who was juggling balls aloft. Dr. O said little. The next day, as soon as I lay down, he said, "I may have erred about the Proust." An error. He had strayed from the right path, imposing an interpretation that may have been true for others, but not for me. And I had known it. Unlike other times when I may have ceded to his presumed authority, this time I had insisted on my own truth. I had never before thought that Dr. O imposed some external interpretive tenet, but his immediate interpretation, literature equals abstraction, seemed like something he had learned in his training, like he had responded in a knee-jerk way instead of actually listening to how meaningful that Proust passage was to me. In doing so, he himself had deflected the pain of what I was saying by accusing me of deflecting it. The fact that he admitted it to me was vital to keeping my trust. As the relief washed over me, that he believed me, I asked him with tears in my eyes, "Do you think I'm manic?" He paused and responded, "I think you're in a lot of pain and you don't know if there's any other way to deal with it than to keep jumping." This was a more compassionate response than what I had expected, which was for him to remain silent or to say that I do instead of think. This time, however, he responded to the sobs as a manifestation of an emotion, not as a hysterical demand for attention. This acknowledgement allowed me to recognize them as real. He and I were beginning to hear the sobs that had always already been there, unheard, unspoken, unknown. Then the next chapter is called L'inutile beauté. My lover's wife and I recognized each other at the cash register at Shoppers Drug Mart. She was buying Q-tips. I don't remember what I was buying. We made small talk. She looked tired and harried, and I compared myself to her. Though I was completely sleep deprived and behind on everything, I was radiant, thanks to the ministrations of her husband. After she'd paid and left, I tried out being angry at her, at the institution of marriage and the precepts of monogamy. What would a society be like in which women weren't expected to respect laws of possession for each other? Why did I have to tone down my desire and my attractiveness so as not to threaten the tired, grumpy wife's ownership of the passive object of her husband? Why was it that those of us who saw through the charade of marriage were expected to respect it? Any outsider would immediately take her side as the wronged one. She, after all, had the culture behind her. She was a faithful wife, whereas I was an adulteress and a liar. I was a social pariah who had deliberately done battle against an institution which was unquestionable. Didn't I know he was married? Didn't I know I was? Yeah, but what about the lie on which these proprietary institutions are founded? My outrage didn't really work. She was an intelligent, beautiful woman who was putting up with her husband's absences and his evasions because of a complex web of household and children and career and family. She may have been practicing her own version of denial and not admitting to herself that her husband had something going on, but it was a whole lot more mature and responsible than his selfish escapism. He and I were doing nothing radical. We were just running away. One night I cuddled up with my sons on the couch and we watched Casablanca. One brown and one blonde head leaned against my shoulders and the black dog draped herself across us. Near the end, Ingrid Bergman stands between the two men, Humphrey Bogart, her dark and brooding true love, and Paul Henride, her staunch and kind husband. They both ask her to stay with them, and she's torn as she looks from one to the other. As he burrowed his greasy fingers into the popcorn bowl on my lap, dark-haired Sebastian said, with a musing tone beyond his years, "It's hard to be a beautiful woman." I thought of myself and my beautiful friends. Most of us are white, educated, middle class, and endowed with so much privilege that our lives should be a piece of cake. Why did Sebastian's words resonate so much? I took inventory of some of our situations. One friend had been having a long-term affair for years, but decided to have her second child by her husband instead of her lover. Another got pregnant by a guy she had a quick affair with and never told her husband or child. Another was trying to decide between the handyman and her academic husband. Another was so hungry for sweetness and physical intimacy that she had drunk unprotected sex that gave her conservative spouse a sexually transmitted disease. Another had decided to be a good wife and mother and was having severe headaches and IBS as she swallowed her anger and put up with his laziness, his selfishness, and his smoking. Another had gone back to her first love, women, after getting two beautiful children out of her workaholic husband. Another used the weekends that her partner was out of town to go online and get the kinky sex she couldn't ask him for. In Minima Moralia, one of Theodore Adorno's aphorisms is about l'inutile beauté, or useless beauty. He says, "Women of exceptional beauty are doomed to unhappiness. Even those favored by every circumstance who have birth, wealth, and talent on their side seem as if hounded or obsessed by the urge to destroy themselves and all human relationships they contract." I saw us beautiful women attracted to men who would become intense and passionate about us. We couldn't resist them, though when we were enamored, we couldn't sleep, we couldn't eat, we were slowly killing ourselves. But it was so addictive, so exciting. I saw us beautiful women talking to the brilliant men. We allowed them to explain things to us. The men abstracted, intellectualized, argued, and asserted. We were somewhat hesitant with our ideas. We smiled when we spoke. We allowed ourselves to be interrupted. We listened when others spoke. We lilted the intonation of our voices so that our statements ended with a question mark. We smoldered with all the things we wanted to say. I saw us beautiful women being mad and mean, like Brer Rabbit who gets caught and says, "Do anything to me except please, please don't throw me in the briar patch." We knew that our safe spot was actually in the bed that we pretended to resist. As long as we could keep our thick skins on, we wouldn't feel the thorns. We could imagine that we were right where we wanted to be. When we were alone with each other, we talked and agreed and commiserated. Manic and anxious, we were angry at the men we had chosen and the limits of our lives. We imagined that another man or another situation would be better. I hated that we were all so unhappy. I never knew what to say when we would have these long, intimate conversations, how much to encourage the fantasies of how things could be different. We nodded and murmured, "I hear you. I know what you mean. Me too." Basically, the question that we were asking, this one or that one, was the wrong one. We continued to believe that we deserved something that we couldn't quite get, that there was someone out there who knew what it was and who could give it to us. The messier questions that we avoided were perhaps the ones that would have gotten us out of this dilemma. Why do I think that this person or object could satisfy me? How can I begin to accept that I don't know the answers and that no one else does either? We weren't stupid. We were just all of a generation that was shaped by the idea that we were entitled to make choices about our lives. That's what mainstream 80s feminism had told us, that we were articulate, proactive, and self-assured agents. It was an important message that our sex lives and choices were our own and that we were entitled to have the things we wanted. Very different from the messages that my mother's generation experienced. It isn't wrong to question the institution of marriage, nor is it wrong to act on your desire and fuck whoever you want. But when I was doing that, I was flailing out as an individual who thinks that she's freely making her own choices. I couldn't see myself as part of a larger structure. Even though the other beautiful women were flailing too, I kept getting caught up in the particulars of each story. The larger dynamic of women's precarity, of sexism and affective and material labor under which we all suffered was so omnipresent that I couldn't see how it kept us trapped in marriages and situations we hated. As if the only options were bogey or the nice husband. As if all the beauty that I saw in my friends and myself all funneled itself into one useless, false choice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was Eva-Lynn Jagoe reading from her recently published work, Take Her, She's Yours. I should point out here, all of these books that we are hearing today are available both in print and in open access. If you go to the Punctum Books website, you can find them there. All right, up next, we have Sasha Zamler-Carhart. Sasha Zamler-Carhart has taught music history at Manus, speculative design at Parsons, and medieval music and Latin at the Royal Conservatoire in The Hague. They are also the lead singer of the improv band Zamler-Carhart Raoul Greenberg. Sasha's new book, The Goths and Other Stories, is forthcoming with Punctum Books. Their band's new album, Matsrikos, on medieval Occitan poetry, is coming out at the same time on CCR Naxos. Thank you so much for being here, Sasha.
Thank you, everybody, for having me. Thank you, Eva-Lynn and Dulce, for reading. It's hard to follow after these two distinguished colleagues. I'm going to read a little bit from my book that's coming out shortly, The Goths and Other Stories. It has several stories, and this is the first one called The Goths. In the winter of 476 AD, the Ostrogoths, hungry and exhausted from wandering for months through the barren hills along the confines of the Byzantine Empire, wrote to Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, requesting permission to enter the walled city of Epidaurus and just kind of crash and charge their phones. My most magnificent and Christian Lord, blessed Emperor of the Romans, light of the East and the West, protector of the universe, wrote Theodoric, chieftain of the Ostrogoths. My people are weary. We've been wandering around the Balkans for months. We're hungry, we're sleep deprived, Our kids are cranky, our feet are smelly, our crotches are itchy. We humbly request permission to settle in the city of Epidaurus and just kind of basically crash there and recharge, like literally and figuratively. Nobody said anything. It was windy. It was cold. The wind kept whistling cheerfully between the rocks like a misguided fanfare adrift in an empty graveyard. The Goths sat awkwardly on the hard, cold rocks. The cold rocks sat on the dead yellow grass. The yellow grass sat on the raw ground. The whole universe sat uncomfortably as if balanced on the edge of a boulder. A hawk circled overhead, looking down like a jaded office worker reading a snack bar menu. Finally, Zeno texted back NP, in Greek, of course. Theodoric gazed fixedly at his phone and at those two imperial letters etched in glimmering gold on a rich, deep crimson field on his screen, a twinkle of splendor, nonchalantly texted from the opulence of Constantinople. Those two little Greek letters acceded to his request, and yet their negligent imperial sparkle seemed so unfair, so inconsiderately lavish in the desolate, muddy emptiness of the cold, bleak Balkans. "All right," said Theodoric aloud, "we're going to Epidaurus. His purple-born majesty is letting us crash there." Exhausted cheers erupted around him like a weak froth fizzing up from a nearly empty espresso machine. "Cityman," said Theodoric to his best knight, "you ride ahead to Epidaurus and get everyone there to leave. Just scare the shit out of them. I want that whole city empty for us." "Very well, my lord. I want no Greeks left in that town. Everyone out." "What am I to do with the ones that won't leave?" "Make them leave." 2 days later, Sidimund arrived at Epidaurus, a city he knew well for having been an exchange student at Epidaurus College for a semester. He appeared at the city gates in the late morning, alone, mounted on a gray horse, his long blonde hair flowing out of a gilded bronze helmet, dotted with gray iron studs in vertical rows, bronze panels engraved with allegories of the seasons over his ears and nose, his pale gray eyes peering between them, a gray fur cape fastened on his right shoulder by an eagle-shaped silver brooch, a gray fur tunic tied around his waist by a garnet-studded silver belt buckle, his hands poised on the bridle, motionless in their gray woolen gloves. Anyone in the empire would have known him as a Gothic knight, still and superb in the winter morning. The sky was low, the air was gray, the horse seemed made of sky and hair, the buckle hewn of rain. The silver glistened stark and cool and winked a silent rimy gleam, a bleaker winter glint. Then crimson garnet's ruby sheen, a flare and coruscating hue, but metal hard and hoar. A leaden light instilled oblique, as if the night had plundered it from jewels in the clouds, and drifted down on frigid winds to rutilate his lute arrayed in gleaming winter gray, insinuating thunder still in the winter morning. The city guards totally freaked out and ran inside to get the governor. The governor was like, "Oh shit, this Goth is like, seriously, bad news, bad news, bad news. Quick, a miracle solution, someone do something quick. Bishop Irenaeus, could he come up with some fancy bishop trick to drive the Goth away? Like maybe some gory relic with like blood and toenails and stuff, or like some spontaneous mass prayer event type thing, lol." Sidimund waited patiently for the bumbling Greeks to finish scurrying around and did not dismount. A tunic tied atop his loins astride atop his horse askance across the gate, its gait assured upon its foot he stood. Was there an inkling in his stance, a hint of helmets in the air, of stride afoot, of screams afar, a crowd atoot as in a shroud, a cloud? He stood, alone for now, his sword at rest. The sky was gray, the air still plain, the horse was still, the plain still bare. He stood, still in the winter morning. Finally, Irenaeus appeared and addressed him. "What brings you, Goths?" said the old man. "Do you seek oats? Do you seek socks? And why? Will you steal goats and plums and frocks? Why? Could you nab kids and kidnap cats, to goad your stock and stick your stocks, to bear your pennant proud and shrill? Bet you will. You're bare of fodder, keen to kill. You're after figs and digs and pigs. Are you, Goth? Do you seek swags and swigs and tricks and tracks and sticks and stacks and food? Do you seek food, you, Goth, so still in the winter morning?" "Dear Mr. Bishop," said Sidimund. "Oh my God, I so do not go by Mr. Bishop," thought Irenaeus, but hey, the situation did not lend itself to being picky about protocol, did it now? "My name is Sidimund, son of Sidimir the Amaling, and I bear a request from my lord Theodoric, chieftain of the Ostrogothic people." "Do you come in peace?" asked Irenaeus. "Well, technically I haven't killed anyone yet," answered Sidimund. He continued, "My request is as follows. My lord Theodoric will be arriving here in a few days with 40,000 armed men and their families in tow. We are hungry and tired and would like to crash in your city. We don't want to have to kill everyone because that's typically time-consuming and stressful. Therefore, we kindly request that you all get the fuck out and leave the city completely empty for us, preferably leaving your refrigerators full for when you arrive, but I don't want to be indelicate about it if you feel strongly about taking your food with you." "But what? Leave? All of us? What about the children, the elderly, the sick? How? Where will we go?" pleaded Irenaeus. "Mr. Bishop, I'm a Gothic knight, not a career counselor." Irenaeus stood silent and stern, like a bishop on a chessboard put in check by an opposing knight. He continued, "Can you give us time at least? When would you want us gone?" "Tonight, by sundown." Sidimund paused, then added, "Would you bring me a small child, like not too small, maybe 6, 7 years old?" I suppose. I'll wait here." The bishop waddled back into the city diagonally, staying on squares of his own color, and reappeared a few minutes later with a terrified young girl, cautiously followed by her anxious mother a dozen paces behind. "Thank you," said Sidimund. "Would you bring her a little closer to the right side of my horse, please? About 2 arms length in front of me and 1 to the right. There. Perfect. Now leave the girl there and please step back for a second. A little further back. Diagonally, of course, and staying on squares of your own color. Yes, to that tree over there, please. Thanks." Sidimund unsheathed his sword and decapitated the little girl in one swift, silent motion, except for the swoosh of the blade skating through the air and the thud of her head falling into the grass. He added, "Can you imagine how long it would take if we have to do this individually to every single person in the city? We can't give everyone that much personal attention, I'm afraid." Irenaeus quietly shat in his underwear and remained speechless. Sidimund moved his horse over to the grass where the girl's head had landed, leaned over slightly, and speared with the tip of his sword as if he was picking up a cherry tomato with a toothpick. He handed the head to Irenaeus, who grabbed it mechanically. "Here, you can have it back. We have tons of these already," said Sidimund while putting his sword away, leaving the girl's head in Irenaeus's hands. "Sundown," he added. Then he turned around and rode away. And that's how far I'm going to go today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sasha. So that was Sasha Zamler-Carhart reading from their forthcoming book, The Goths and Other Stories. Finally, today we are joined by A.W. Strouse. A.W. Strouse grew up in Appalachian, Pennsylvania, in a rural community that was destroyed by free trade. Strauss has spent most of his adult life in New York City, in neighborhoods that have been destroyed by gentrification. Strauss has worked as a part-time professor of medieval literature at universities that soon may no longer exist. Strauss considers COVID-19 to be the total accumulation of the neoliberal surveillance capitalist coup, and he is currently hiding out in Iceland. Thank you so much for being here, AW.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, I was feeling kind of in an existential funk when I sent Dan my biography, and this has been really nourishing, and so I'm really thankful to Punctum and to Dan for putting this together, and thank you to my co-readers. I'm going to share from my recent Punctum book, Gender Trouble Couplets, and I'll just preface it by explaining that it was inspired by a 13th century encyclopedia called the Petite Philosophy that was written in rhyme, in octosyllabic couplets. And this was a kind of minor genre in the 13th century, encyclopedias that rhyme. And I thought, what a fantastic idea. I will try to execute this by rewriting Judith Butler's Gender Trouble sentence by sentence into a rhyming poem. And I will just read a little bit of that. So this is Gender Trouble Couplets. The first section is called Women as the Subject of Feminism. But must there be a womankind, a female heart and female mind? For feminism to exist, then must there be a second sex? If feminism's greatest goals are liberated gender roles, then gender we presume as given. It is the base from which we're driven. This woman then would constitute the prosecutor of our suit. And she's the one politically whom we are serving fervently. And she's the one we'd represent with feminism's argument. Yet politics is no sure term, nor representing very firm. Well, representing helps, it's true, to win a civil right or two, but it oppresses us as well. A man-made mold or iron shell, it must distort what it would show. At least that's how I read Rousseau. But we have tried to represent this woman to her betterment, to find a language or discourse that we could use as a resource to make this gender visible and make our protest critical. Indeed, there's some necessity in raising visibility, since woman's life is not presented in ways with which we're well contented. And so it seems we need a woman, the a priori subject given. Yet woman is no longer stable, a term whose standing's now ill-able, because there is, of course, debate on what by woman we'd relate. For surely there aren't absolutes, nor truth that woman constitutes. Now, first of all, there is some doubt on what the subject's all about. I'm sure by now that you will know the theories of Michel Foucault, who claims that power will create the subjects it would subjugate. This power works by prohibition, by regulation, limitation, and discipline for our protection, perhaps with choices and election. And so its subjects are controlled as power shapes them in its mold. For it defines and then produces these subjects for its certain uses. If this be true, then we must ask, what is the subject of our task? If feminism takes as given that there are subjects known as women, how can we trust this formulation that simply powers machination? In fact, the subject whom we'd free is power's subjectivity. This system made those very subjects, according to its rules and its checks, dictate those terms, so we will find that we are caught up in a bind. I'm going to skip ahead to section 3 and read a bit of that. This is Gender, the Circular Ruins of Contemporary Debate. Is gender what you have or be? Is gender just made culturally? Could we construct it differently? Is there a possibility of any gender agency? Is gender's universal axis then always framed as different sexes? And is there ever any gender that's to the gendered subject prior? Now, some would say this very notion of gender as man-made construction functions deterministically or even syllogistically, encoding bodies culturally in meanings anatomically assigned and coded passively, as though it weren't biology, but forces awfully culturally that thereby frame our destiny. And then in Simone de Beauvoir, within her classic Ouvroir, are these thoughts you may have read before: a woman's not as woman born, but she becomes as she would learn. Preceding gender, there is an ego, an agent whom we'll call cogito, who at some point takes on a gender and therefore might have picked the other. Construction then is not a choice? Or does compulsion steal one's voice? And does compulsion come from sex, or made as culture so expects? And then just to give you a taste of the last little bit, I will skip ahead to that. So gender's just a repetition, or really a stylization, a set of acts that over time congeal along an ordered line, producing somehow appearance of a being with a substance. To do the genealogy of gender as ontology would deconstruct thus the appearance into such acts sans a substance, and locate these acts within frames built by power for its own aims, conforming to the names it names, to show as mere contingency what seemed like a necessity has been one of the major parts of criticism after Marx. But now this task must intersect with the gender of all subjects, admitting possibility foreclosed by power's policy, which structures its ontology. So later, my analysis investigates the structuralist account of different sexual, as this may still prove possible, contesting modes of power for the presumed coherence of gender and sex's univocity within the system binary, are now revealed as idle fictions which just allow consolidations of power's masculinity and heterosexuality. Also, we must view the body not as such a surface ready to receive signification, but a scene of contestation, a blurry set of boundaries controlled by power's functionaries. No, sex is not identity, but a performativity, which is, in fact, not A to B. And when gender has been denaturalized and its social construction realized, and the terms of gender remobilized, so that the terms that once had crystallized, even in the feminist enterprise, can now all be somehow restylized, then can gender trouble be strategized, reconfigured, performed, and satirized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, AW. Well, that is all of our readings for today. Thank you so much to Dulce Smith, Eva-Lynn Jagoe, Sasha Zamler-Carhart, and A.W. Strouse for reading their Punctum books. That was just so lovely. Thank you all so much. Once again, all of these books are available. Sasha's is forthcoming, but otherwise they are currently available. If you go to the Punctum Books website, you can order them or find them in open access. Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Open Publishing Fest, and I hope you all are safe and healthy, and be well. We'll talk to you all again soon.